It's a long-running theory that is popular among gamers that the Sheikah and the Gerudo from the Legend of Zelda series are bitter rivals, and that they're in a constant state of conflict. Some would even go so far as to suggest that they were the two main powers behind the Hylian Civil War, which preceded the events of the Ocarina of Time. But what if their origins were more similar than we were led to believe? Hey guys, it's crazy old Nick here, coming at you again with another crazy old theory. This time looking at the inherent differences and the similarities between two of the Zelda franchise's races, and maybe looking at how they might not be quite so different. Let's begin with the Gerudo. For those not well versed in the lore of Zelda, the common theory is that Grouse and his friends leave Zelda and Link at the end of Skyward Sword in search of their own destinies on the surface, that they head west to a valley, and that they founded a community there, and that they named it after the Gerudo dragonfly that Grouse's friend Stretch would have been pleased to note were common in the area, because he loves bugs. The insignia of the insect would remain as their sigil for later generations, but whatever goodwill Groose had carried with him did not remain with the descendants. In the generations to come, the Gerudos would become fearsome thieves with a Spartan tendency to cast out any male-born offspring, except for one born every 100 years. The Groose bloodline is a common theory, and while it has its merits, I tend to disagree with it to an extent. If you've seen my Skyward Sword timeline placement video, you may already be familiar with my thoughts, but since I feel I haven't given my theory enough support, this is what I believe. Skyward Sword is largely not placed at the beginning of time in the Zelda timeline. The events from the point of Link waking up to the point of the Gate of Time opening happens in a distant future on a separate timeline, a tangent where Demise has been free to wreak havoc for millennia before he was mysteriously sealed away. When Link travels back through time, through the Gate of Time, he's travelling many thousands of years. This is referenced both by Zelda and by Fi throughout the game. Link travels back in time and defeats Demise in the past, creating a split in the timeline. He enshrines the Master Sword in the sealed temple at the end of the game and returns to his world and time, ready to start a new life with Zelda. However, in the past, where Demise was killed at the height of his power, a new split becomes our new canon timeline, with the ruins of the sealed ground becoming the first settlement of Hyrule, and the curse that Demise placed, setting up the events for the Ocarina of Time. I know what you're thinking, that this is a fanciful thought, but Hyrule Historia states that at the beginning of the timeline there was the creation, which we know was orchestrated by Din, Pharaoh, and Naru. The creation is said to be followed immediately by the events of Skyward Sword. Immediately by those events. Well, one of those events was travel to the distant past to defeat Demise, right? Sure, other events are the war between Hylia and Demise, which we know must have happened before the point you return to, because Skyloft, or at least the goddess statue, is missing from the sealed grounds. But on the other hand, in the Skyward Sword present, you have advanced technology in the East, which never makes an appearance again in the Zelda games in later timelines. A series of ornate and majestic temples such as the Earth Temple, the Ancient Cistern, the Skyview Temple, heck, even the Naru mining facility, which doesn't appear in later games in the timeline. Were they demolished or covered up? Or were they built in a later time and eradicated from history when time started over under different circumstances and with the absence of Demise? Not to mention the fact that at the end of the first three temples, Fi advises Link that there are messages left for him written in the forgotten language of the old gods. And she specifically says the old gods, the ones who just apparently created Hyrule. How come they are remembered in Ocarina of Time and worshipped, but not in Skyward Sword? Instead, there is this fourth goddess, Hylia, who has towering monuments in her image. So why is there a gap between the creation and Ocarina of Time, where these deities just disappear from human memory? Anyway, I digress, but for a very good reason. If my theory is true, then Grouse is not the founder of the Gerudo, however interesting that may be. Instead, Gondo may be a likely descendant of the Gerudo if they even existed in this rogue timeline. I say that because it seems that his family have some sort of connection to the western region of the surface, what with his grandfather having recovered an ancient robot who becomes a reluctant helper to Link later on in the game. Let's now put the Sheikah under the lens. Prior to the release of Breath of the Wild, we had only ever known 3 true Sheikah, that is Impa, Impaz, and Finadi. Interestingly, all of them female. The Sheikah are a solitary and mysterious culture, sworn to protect the Hyrule royal line. Their sigil is that of a weeping eye. Some people believe that this teardrop represents a time when they were betrayed in the past. The sigil first appeared in the Ocarina of Time, occurring after the Civil War. The theory goes that at some point there was a schism within the Sheikah cult. The Shadow Temple, the home base of the Sheikah culture, carries this theme with its hints at Hyrule's bloody past. When Twilight Princess was released, it became apparent that the division within the Sheikah ranks was due to a group named the Interlopers, who sought to take the Triforce for themselves. At least that's what everyone believes. While this theory holds a lot of sound reasoning, it has never been blatantly stated before. The other interesting thing is that the Sheikah sigil appears in Skyward Sword, worn by Impa from the past, young Impa, who was from the beginning of the timeline, from a time perhaps before the Interlopers could have gathered knowledge on the Triforce. So if the sigil was not inspired by the Interlopers' betrayal, what could it have come from? Perhaps it wasn't the first time there'd been a division for the Sheikah. Let's take a look at how the two cultures compare the first time we meet them. Ocarina of Time. The Sheikah occupy the northeastern corner of Hyrule Field. They hold a recently expanded village that has just been opened to the Hylians to settle in, and have agents operating in the Hyrule Castle and Hyrule Castle Town. Though they are tasked with protecting the royal family, they appear to hang in the shadows around the graveyard and let the royal guards and soldiers be the known face of the regent's army. Only one member of the Sheikah is known to surface at this time, Impa, the protector of Zelda, and in the past her nursemaid who even sang her lullaby, which was really an ancient song with sacred power behind the notes. The Gerudo, on the other hand, occupy a valley to the west, as well as an ancient structure in a desert, known as the Desert Colossus. They are known to the people of Castletown and Kakariko Village as being an Amazonian-esque race of female warriors who promiscuously sneak into eastern regions to take men into their beds and sire children. This does raise a few questions about the couple that you can see in Castletown as Kid Link, and also who Malin's mother might have been. But that is perhaps another video. Back to the Gerudo. There is some vast possibility that they hold outposts in other far distant regions, as seen by the pirate fortress in Majora's Mask. At a glance, the two cultures are vastly different, but when you look closer, your opinion might change. The first thing that brought my attention to this was the fact that you needed the Lens of Truth to complete the Spirit Temple inside the Desert Colossus. Yeah, I know it makes sense, because if you're playing the game linearly, you'll have the Lens of Truth already. Even though it's not actually a prerequisite for the Shadow Temple, it just makes things a hell of a lot easier. But think about the narrative that this opens. If the Gerudo and the Sheikah truly are sworn enemies, then why have they made the last line of defense for the desert fortress penetrable by the Sheikah? It's like if Donald Trump made his proposed wall out of taco shells. Is that racist? I think it might be a little bit racist. I'm sorry, Mexico. The Lens of Truth can also be used inside the temple to see invisible enemies, as well as inside the Gerudo training ground to solve puzzles. There's at least one key that you just miss it. You know, where the likes are, you just miss it if you don't know it's there. I backtracked through that whole thing. Had to find it. It was difficult. Damn difficult without that Lens of Truth. Both the temple and the training ground also make use of the Silver Rupee puzzle, which only appears in the well in Kakariko Village and the Shadow Temple as well in that creepy Reaper room. Try saying that 10 times really fast. Okay, granted the Silver Rupees also appear in the Ice Cavern. I've got nothing on that, except that Sheik is at the end of that, so maybe it was a test for Link. And also they appear in Ganon's castle, which makes sense because he is a Gerudo, so he would utilize that test. While we're on the subject of the Gerudo training ground, however, there is this one thing, oddly reminiscent of the Sheikah sigil, no? And if you want to tell me that's only there so they can practice piercing the eyes of their enemy, then why is it also on the backs of the thrones in which the Iron Knuckles sit on in the Spirit Temple? Why is it there? Also, why are there no less than 3 places in the Spirit Temple where you can play Zelda's Lullaby to activate secrets or open the way forward? Zelda's Lullaby, the song that was meant to be a secret known only to the royal family and the Sheikah and their close personal allies. Why is it that both cultures are heavily dominated by female characters, whereas males born into their cultures seem to be given important roles, such as kings, or in the case of Breath of the Wild, monks? Could it be that they are related, and that at some point in the past they were separated over an internal conflict? Now I know what you're going to say, but they're brown and she's white. And yes, that does sound racist. Shame on you. Granted that in the game Impa's pigment is of the lighter variety, her artwork in the manual paints a different picture. Impa in Skyward Sword was also of slightly darker skin. There's also the argument that the Gerudos are of darker skin because the schism happened so long ago that they've now adjusted to living in the desert where there is little relief from the constant sun, and they've evolved to having more melanin, whereas the Sheikah who spend time in the shadows are pale and pasty. The other thing you're going to tell me is that their eye colour and hair colour are different. That is true enough, except that we're only really basing this on a very small number of what the Sheikah actually look like. If you look at Impa from Skyward Sword, young Impa from the beginning of time, her skin is dark, her hair is blonde, and her eyes are red. If you just reverse the pigmentation in her eyes and her hair, she would actually pass for a Gerudo. And come on, this is Zelda, a series where the Zora evolved into the Rito over the course of a couple of centuries, so you can't really use that logic. There is also the appearance of the stones only be moved by the Song of Time in the training grounds and in the Spirit Temple, as well as in Dampé's grave. This seemed to be linked to the Temple of Time, which I've suggested in previous videos, and now has more grounds with the latest footage from Breath of the Wild, as holding some importance with the goddess Hylia. Now we come to the Bemis, another link between the two races. Annoying creatures, the Bemis are sentries that appear to take the design of the Sheikah sigil. They are found in the Shadow Temple, but Link first encounters them in the Dodongo's cavern, where the Gorons have told him that Ganondorf's forces have seized control, which means that Bemis are used by Ganon's army. Aside from Ganon's castle, they are also prominent in the Spirit Temple. It is interesting that the Bemis are also the guardians in the Tower of the Gods in the Wind Waker, as well as in the Temple of Time in Twilight Princess, and also in the Lanayru mining facility, which is connected to the original Temple of Time in Skyward. So Bemis appear to be connected with the goddess, or the goddesses, who in turn have a connection with the Sheikah. So how did the Gerudo tap into this secret from the Shadow Folk? It's probably because they had some kind of relationship in the past. They broke up, and the Gerudo got half their stuff. You're probably sitting there thinking, that's nice, but what's your point in all this? Well, thank you. That's a simple question, and my point is this. If I am correct, then at some point in the past, the Gerudo and the Sheikah were as one, and then they became divided, whether it was by mutual agreement or over some lasting feud. The singular became two. But imagine if they didn't. Imagine what their culture might be like, what it might look like if they were still together. Could you imagine what an individual from that culture might look like? What's that? You've already seen something like that before? That's right. The artwork and the early teasers from Breath of the Wild show Link wearing a Gerudo gauntlet and a Sheikah cloak. We have also had it confirmed that Link has been asleep for 100 years before he was awakened in Breath of the Wild. This is the same period of time that the Gerudo culture observes before they decide to let an heir survive infancy. So if Link in Breath of the Wild is a product of a combined culture of Sheikah and Gerudo, does Breath of the Wild actually take place in a timeline presented in Hyrule Historia? Or is it possible that the alternative I've suggested in the beginning of this video might be a better fit? It would explain the presence of the goddess statue in Breath of the Wild appearing in what looks like the Temple of Time. Admittedly, it doesn't explain how the Temple of Time is there, because it's meant to be the sealed temple in this timeline and all that, whatever, but it's not perfect, but I also can't deny the fact. It might also give some backing to the mysterious floating island which can be seen in the gameplay footage as potentially being Skyloft. And it also aligns with the story of the goddess's chosen hero who was presented with a sailcloth as told by Zelda in the wing ceremony in Skyward Sword. In this separate timeline, the Bemis archetype that the goddesses used to defend themselves may have evolved into a more aggressive design, which we see in the Guardians. And these, like the Bemis technology in Ocarina of Time, could have somehow fallen into Ganon's hand. Ah yes, then we come to Ganon, or Calamity Ganon as he's known in this game. How can I explain that away, when we know that Ganon's first chronological appearance was as Ganondorf in the Ocarina of Time, and then he eventually became Ganon towards the end of that game. And I'm saying that all of these events are potentially on a separate timeline where Ganondorf never existed. So who is Ganondorf? He was born into the Gerudo tribe. His birth was ordained by their customs. The first boy in 100 years, there would have been a lot of expectation in him. Further still, his witch aunts might have sensed some great destiny for him, just as the Deku Tree did with Link. The name Ganondorf may have been selected even a century before he was conceived. Hell, it might have even been the name worn by the mantle of all the King of Thieves, just as the name Zelda was passed down to every firstborn girl of the royal family. Only the Gerudo could truly know the etymology of the name Ganondorf, unless of course the Gerudo's language has common roots with the Sheikah, if they do indeed share a past with each other. The Sheikah are keepers of legend. There may have been some story of a malicious spirit named Ganon who threatened their way of life. After the splitting of their faction, the new leader of the Gerudo incursion may have chosen the name for himself as a symbol that he would be the end of their once brothers, the Sheikah. In another timeline where Ganondorf was never born and Demise still lived, the people of the surface may have turned to the Sheikah for guidance. They might not have known at this point what the murderous force was. The Sheikah might not have even known about Demise at that point either. So what would the Sheikah call the Demon King in that case? Perhaps they would pull a name from their lore until they could be sure what they were dealing with. Maybe they had a name, Ganon, reserved for an evil malevolent spirit. At the beginning of Skyward Sword, Demise was sealed away in the sealed grounds. Who put him there? Hylia? She had to escape his power and await her hero to return. So who was her hero in the first time? As I said at the beginning of this video, this is just a theory, folks. But I'd be keen to hear your input. Let me know your thoughts. I'd really appreciate your support in sharing this video as well if you know someone who might enjoy it. Anyway, until next time, I've been Nick, and you've been you, and if you like watching Zelda videos, I've got a bunch of other stuff on my channel, including how to make a Master Sword, and just some little fun stuff that I put together as well. So feel free to check it out, and comment below on your thoughts. Cheers.